So this week we're looking at bar and bat mitzvah, confirmation, and lifelong learning. Can everybody see me and hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up. All right, excellent. That's what I like to see. So remember, all of these courses, or all of the sessions of this course are recorded and posted online so that if you miss a class, you can always go back and rewatch it. There's a lot in this one session: bar and bat mitzvah and confirmation and lifelong learning. But they're really all interconnected, I think you'll find. So first of all, what is a bar or bat mitzvah? That's a very important question to start with. What are we even talking about here? We'll start with the word mitzvah. That's probably the easier part. A mitzvah is colloquially known as a good deed. Try saying that 3 times fast. Colloquially. We say, what is a mitzvah? It's a good deed. That's not quite on the money. We use it as a euphemism for a good deed, but literally a mitzvah is a commandment. The word mitzvah means commandment. So that's the second half of bar or bat mitzvah, and the first half, bar or bat, is literally son or daughter. So we put that together, we get b'nai, which is more than one. If you've ever heard of b'nai mitzvah, you'll hear me referring to b'nai mitzvah multiple times here. That's the plural. Multiple bar and bat mitzvahs, you put them together, that's b'nai mitzvah. That's the plural. I'll also use b'nai mitzvah as sort of a gender non-specific term that could be bar or bat, just like you might say one or they in English to indicate it could be anybody. We struggle with this Hebrew language that is gender specific in every aspect, and when we want to talk about boys and girls together, that makes it a little bit complicated. So I'll use the plural sometimes. B'nai, if I say, b'nai mitzvah, I'm talking about just the general idea, the general concept, not a specific person who's a boy or a girl. Now, compare this word b'nai with other places where you see it. For example, in the Torah, you very often see b'nai Yisrael. And what is b'nai Yisrael? Those are Israelites. So if you put b'nai and mitzvah together, using that same construct, what do you get? B'nai plus mitzvah is mitzvahites, which actually is not a bad translation, because a b'nai mitzvah, mitzvahites, these are the group of people who are part of the group that does mitzvahs. That is to say, Jewish adults. Now, the important thing here is that it's a person, not an event. We often, again, colloquially, I got it right that time, we talk about having a bar mitzvah. Oh, when was your bar mitzvah? I'm going to have a big bar mitzvah. Oh, your bat mitzvah was such a nice event. But really what we mean to say is the celebration of your becoming a bar mitzvah, the celebration of your becoming a bat mitzvah, but that's a mouthful, so we sort of shorten it. But really, the bar mitzvah or the bat mitzvah is not the event, it's the person. Now let's expand this a little bit more. What is a mitzvah? We know it's a commandment, but what types of commandments are we talking about? A mitzvah is a very specific kind of commandment. It's not just a command. I might give you a command. Your computer might give you a command, or you might give your computer a command, and maybe it listens and maybe it doesn't. But when God gives you a command, that's when you really better listen up, right? So a mitzvah is a command from God. Those can include good deeds. That can include prayer as a community, coming together for holidays, coming together for study like we are right now, learning and teaching. These are the aspects, all mitzvahs that we do generally fall into one of these three categories. Either you're out doing a good deed, we call that a mitzvah, you're helping in the Jewish community, either leading prayers, celebrating holidays, taking part in Jewish rituals, or learning and teaching. Uh, like we're doing right now, this is a mitzvah. That's why we say a blessing over Torah study, and we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about lifelong learning. So when somebody becomes a bar or bat mitzvah, how do they show, how do they signify that they have done all of those things? Remember, there are three categories of mitzvahs, the first being good deeds. Well, every bar or bat mitzvah candidate will do a mitzvah project. The requirements vary between different congregations. Some congregations don't even have a mitzvah project, but that's pretty rare these days. I think it's a pretty widespread practice in just about every synagogue you go to. There will be some form of a mitzvah project, which is an expectation that the bar or bat mitzvah candidate will perform some kind of a project, some kind of a good deed that makes an improvement on the world around them. That could be something in the synagogue, it could be something outside of the synagogue. And I always encourage a bar or bat mitzvah to think about how they can do a project in a Jewish way. For example, if they are doing a project for a cause they're really passionate about, maybe they really care a lot about medicine and making sure that people receive medicine. Well, there are a lot of Jewish organizations that do exactly that. They provide medicine for people when they're in need. What about the second type of mitzvah? Prayer, community, holidays, Jewish customs. Well, a bar or bat mitzvah is expected to lead the congregation in prayer. This is the heart of the bar or bat mitzvah service. And the heart of the heart is the learning and teaching that they do. Well, first of all, there's a lot of learning that goes into becoming a bar or bat mitzvah, because you have to learn all of the rituals, all of the prayers, and all of the Torah reading. There's also an aspect of teaching. They say if you really want to make sure that you know something well, you should be able to teach it. And so part of the bar or bat mitzvah service is reading from the Torah and then teaching about it. We usually call that a sermon or a devar Torah. So let's talk about this ceremony of becoming a bar or bat mitzvah. We have conceptually what it's all about. What does it actually consist of? What are the rules for becoming a bar or bat mitzvah? What are the requirements? Well, first of all, when does it happen? Usually, for a boy, it's 13 and a day, or traditionally 12 for a girl. That's 13 years plus 1 day. Now, traditionally, historically, there was no such thing as a bat mitzvah. There was only bar mitzvah. It was only reserved for boys. Women were not considered to be bound to all of the commandments, meaning there were some commandments, such as saying the Amidah in daily prayer, that women were considered exempt from, because they would be busy taking care of the children or cleaning the home or cooking the food. And the idea was that these particular mitzvot that had to be done at a particular time shouldn't be permitted to interrupt a woman's life with the assumption that a woman's life entails all of those things, taking care of the kids and cooking the food, etc., etc. Of course, we live in an age where that's not necessarily the case. That's not necessarily a woman's life. And as a result, we, at least in this community, don't distinguish between the role of a man in the synagogue and the role of a woman in the synagogue. Both men and women can lead prayer. Both men and women can read from the Torah. Both men and women can sing during the service. These are some basic principles of Reform Judaism. We're going to talk more about the differences between Reform and Orthodox, etc., etc., etc. The whole ABCs of Judaism, not this week, but next week. As a result of Reform and Reconstructionist and conservative synagogues, as well as others, creating the bat mitzvah, the very first bat mitzvah. The reason I include Reconstructionist, because that was the very first bat mitzvah. Reconstructionist movement, we'll talk more about next week, was founded by Mordecai Kaplan, and the very first bat mitzvah was his daughter. So that was the first bat mitzvah. Now it's a very common ceremony for both boys and girls. We have b'nai mitzvah for all children, although we do still sometimes use the halachic 12 years and 1 day, which you also see in some Orthodox communities now that they've borrowed that custom from other groups of Jews, but they've adapted it so that it continues to fit into an Orthodox framework, usually called a bat Torah. Rather than reading from a Torah, a young woman might read from Psalms, or read from one of the scrolls, or read from another book of the Tanakh, rather than from the Chumash, from the 5 books of Moses. So they fill a similar role. They lead certain prayers, but they're not leading the service, and they're certainly not reading from the Torah, which is the major requirement of a b'nai mitzvah, reading from the Torah. In fact, traditionally, b'nai mitzvah just meant this was your first aliyah, the first time you're called up to the Torah. In ancient times, an aliyah, when you're called up to the Torah, also meant that you read the Torah. Now we have one person who's called up, who says the blessings, and another person who reads the Torah on their behalf. Although you can be called up to the Torah and then read the Torah as well in the traditional way, which is often what we do for a bar or bat mitzvah service. The other key part of the ceremony, the service itself, is reciting the Shema, which is a responsive prayer. You've got the Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, and then you've got the responsive line, which is Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. Because you're leading a prayer, because there is a leader and a response, that's what seals it as a service leader, a shliach tzibur. You may see that in your reading, shliach tzibur, which means prayer leader. Now, usually, at least in this community, a bar bat mitzvah happens on Shabbat. But really, it can be any time we read Torah, which can be a weekday or Shabbat. Now, in this congregation, along with many Reform congregations and many conservative congregations as well, we only read we only read Torah as a community on Shabbat. Therefore, the weekday service, the weekday Torah reading, is not something we're accustomed to, and it might not be part of our normal day-to-day and week-to-week practice, but there are 2 traditional Torah readings during the week where you could have a bar or bat mitzvah. It does not have to be on Shabbat. Other customs that are associated with b'nai mitzvah are receiving your first talit, because you are now obligated to wear a talis or talit, same thing, just different pronunciation. Putting tefillin, we wrap around your arm, and again, this can be for boys or girls. Tefillin, like the bar mitzvah, were originally only reserved for men, because they were one of those commandments that were considered to be an interruption to a woman's obligations in the home. But now, that we live in a different world where men and women have obligations in the home, men and women have obligations in the workplace, then women can wear tefillin as well. There are traditional gifts like a yod, which is a pointer used to read the Torah. We talked about that previously. Or giving a kiddush cup or another ritual object as a gift so that a young Jewish adult can begin to build their Judaica. We read in Pirkei Avot. What is Pirkei Avot? It comes straight from the Mishnah. It's also known as chapters of our fathers. If you only read one piece of Mishnah, this should be it. Read Pirkei Avot. It's not that long. You can often get it in its own separate book. You can get lots of lovely commentaries. You can get it in English or Spanish or any language you'd like. And there's a lot of wisdom in there. It's sort of like a greatest hits collection of the classical rabbis of the Mishnah. So in Avot, chapter 5, Mishnah 21, we read, at 5 years of age, the study of Scripture. At 10, the study of Mishnah. At 13, subject to the commandments, meaning mitzvot. At 15, the study of Talmud. At 18, the bridal canopy. At 20, for the pursuit of a livelihood. 30, the peak of strength. At 40, wisdom. At 50, able to give counsel. At 60, old age. At 70, I don't know about that one, fullness of years. At 80, the age of strength. At 90, a bent body. And at 100, as good as dead and completely out of the world. These are not my words. This is words from our tradition that describe the typical life cycle according to Rabbi Judah. You notice in here two important parts. At 13, subject to the commandments, meaning mitzvot, bar mitzvah, and in this case it is bar mitzvah. At 15, the study of Talmud. So remember those two numbers. You might wonder, where do we get this number 13 from? Well, this is where it comes from. By the way, the 12 for a girl, being 1 year younger, is a little bit more of a complicated answer. There are a few different sources, but basically the argument that is made in the Talmud is that women are just a little bit more emotionally mature than men, that they grow up a little bit sooner. So far, I've met very few people who disagree with that. There's also a passage in the Talmud where a rabbi and his daughter at 12 years old, that she helps him fulfill a mitzvah, and so that is used as a proof that a 12-year-old girl can perform a mitzvah in the same way that a 13-year-old boy can. So what goes into the preparation for becoming a bar or bat mitzvah? First of all, it's a lifetime of learning. I once had, in my very first pulpit as a student, I had somebody come to me and he said, okay, my daughter, she's turning 13 in a couple of months. I want you to give her a bat mitzvah. I say, okay, well, has she studied? No, we're not part of the temple, but we're Jewish. And yeah, we just I think it's a nice thing to do. And I said, whoa, whoa, whoa. You can't just become a bat mitzvah overnight. It takes a lot of work. Our students here start studying from kindergarten. They start learning about mitzvot. They start studying Hebrew. And they study Hebrew for years and years before they're able to read and put together the prayers and the nusach, the music of the service, leading up to becoming a bar or bat mitzvah. That's followed by a year-long course of intense study, working individually with a tutor in most cases, or with a rabbi, or both. And during that 1 year process of individual tutoring is where a student will learn their Torah reading, their Haftarah, which will be different for every student depending on the week of the year that their service falls. That's followed by continuing learning, a commitment to continue learning in youth programs, as a teacher in the Sunday school, in attending courses at the temple. All of these different ways in which a person, now a young adult, can continue their Jewish education. The service project itself doesn't happen overnight. It takes months of planning and a lot of learning about overcoming obstacles in order to be able to fulfill the requirements of the service project so that they can make a positive impact in the world. The most important lesson, in my opinion, that students learn in the process is that it's not always a straight path, that there are always bumps in the road when you try to work to make the world a better place. It's very easy sitting on the sidelines, no pun intended for those of you that are watching sports this evening. It's very easy sitting from the sidelines to say, why doesn't somebody just fix this? When you get in there and get your hands dirty and start actually working to fix something, you realize that it's not always as easy as it looks. That's the most important lesson that these young adults learn, is that if you want to get something done, it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of effort in overcoming obstacles. And of course, you've got to plan the party. I don't talk a lot about the party because the party is the one part that most people really get without much help. In fact, a lot of parties go overboard. I know of a community in New York, this was years ago, probably 20 or 30 years ago, that had a big community meeting because every B'nai Mitzvah had to be bigger and better and fancier and more extravagant than the one before it. And they had to come together as a community and say, listen, we're going bankrupt on these parties. And they signed a pact as a community that nobody in the community would go over a certain amount for the party. That returned, sort of was the reset button in that particular community, where they were able to refocus on the meaning of the celebration rather than making the celebration the whole reason for becoming a bar bat mitzvah. In other words, it's not for partying, but we still want to celebrate. Because it is a happy event, we still want to make sure that we're celebrating. Let's talk about the Jewish value of education. Obviously, that's a part of becoming a bar bat mitzvah, but it goes well beyond that. We have a blessing over Torah study. We're going to say it together right now. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah, which means, blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of all, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage with words of Torah. This blessing right here is tells us exactly how we feel about learning, because the word Torah actually means teaching. It means teaching. Engaging in words of Torah, engaging with Jewish teaching, is not just a laudable pastime. It is something that is near and dear to us to the point that it is a commandment. Just like lighting the Shabbat candles, just like honoring your father and mother. Engaging in words of Torah is a commandment from God that we fulfill. And it is a commandment that makes us holy. God hallows us with commandments, including this one. But now that we've said the blessing, we better study some Torah. We'll start with some very literally right out of Deuteronomy. Right out of Deuteronomy, Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. This might sound familiar. You shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Take to heart these instructions, with which I charge you this day. Pay attention. Teach them diligently to your children. Recite them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you get up. Right there in the Shema, in the V'ahavta, one of the central prayers of Judaism, one of the most important prayers we say every single day, twice a day. We have this obligation to teach Torah to your children. In the Talmud, you can find this in Kiddushin 40b. Rabbi Tarfon and the elders were reclining in the loft of the house of Nitzia in Lod when this question was posed to them. Is study greater or is action greater? Rabbi Tarfon answered and said, action is greater. Is it more important to learn the Torah or more important to do the Torah? Rabbi Akiva answered and said, study is greater. Everyone gathered there said, study is greater because study leads to action. Is it more important to study Torah or do Torah? Well, you have to study it so that you know what to do and you know how to do it well. Study is the more important part, according to the Talmud. Pirkei Avot. Remember Pirkei Avot? We saw Pirkei Avot a little bit earlier. Again from the Mishnah. Ben Zoma says, who is wise? He who learns from all people, as it says, I have acquired understanding from all my teachers. This tells us that Talmud Torah, that the study of Torah, isn't just limited to Jewish texts. It isn't just limited to what I tell you as a rabbi. You have to learn from one another. Learn from each other's lives. Learn from the teachings of all teachers, not just one. And finally, in the Mishnah Torah, this comes from Maimonides, who tells us, as he's describing all of the obligations we have as Jews, he says, just as a person is obligated to teach his son, so too he's obligated to teach his grandson, as it says, and make them known to your children and your children's children. That's from Deuteronomy. And just as his son and his grandson, rather there is a command upon each and every wise person of Israel, meaning of the Jewish people, to teach all students, even though they are not his children, as it says, and you shall tutor them to your children. From an oral tradition, they learned that your children, in this case, refers to students. For students can be called children. There's an example from Kings, the prophets' children, and the children of the prophets left. So what do we learn? You have to teach your children Judaism, Torah, right and wrong. You have to teach your grandchildren. And not only that, but if you have wisdom to offer, you're obligated to offer it to everyone you can. That's the Jewish value of education. It teaches us how to live. It's not just about information. It's not just about fulfilling mitzvot. It's not just about obligations. It's not just about traditions, but it's about day-to-day life. It's about how to be an honest, upright person. On top of that, study is an end to itself. In fact, study is equal to prayer in Judaism. Coming together for study is considered a sacred act in the same way that praying in a synagogue is considered a sacred act. As I mentioned, the very word Torah means teaching. It doesn't get any more obvious than that. Therefore, we have a lifestyle of study across our years. Some examples of this are the yeshiva system, schools that were set up throughout the ages for usually boys, again, sorry ladies, for young boys to learn how to read, not only in their native languages, whether that was Russian or Polish or German or Arabic or Farsi or whatever their native language might be, but also in Hebrew and Aramaic, so that they can study Torah and Talmud. For this reason, we've had very high literacy rates, far ahead of our neighbors, for hundreds of years. And you find in every Jewish home, Jewish books. There is an entire industry of Jewish publishing that, again, goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. This includes, by the way, both traditional books like your Torah, your Talmud, your Mishnah, and contemporary books that take those ideas and reinvigorate them for modern comprehension. We have a strong tradition of religious schools, and that doesn't include only Sunday schools, but also many communities with a large enough Jewish population have Jewish day schools, where children learn day in and day out how to live a Jewish life. And they learn all of the texts of our tradition. And believe me, you can learn a lot more in a week than you can in an hour or two on Sundays. But even in a community that doesn't have a large enough population to support a day school, and you need a pretty large population, even in a community that can't support a day school yet, you still find religious schools going back again hundreds of years, where weekly instruction in a Sunday school or a weekday religious school gives every single Jew the background and the tools to build their Jewish education. Which leads us to confirmation. What is confirmation? Where did it come from? Confirmation was originally introduced by Reform Judaism. And when it was introduced in the 1800s, the idea was that it would replace bar mitzvah. And by the way, at this time, there still was no such thing as a bat mitzvah. Confirmation was just for boys. There was no confirmation for girls. The idea was that bar and bat mitzvah was this older tradition that was based on physical maturity, physical development, that the idea of a 13-year-old, we even joke about it now, you're 13 years old, you're a man, now go and do your homework. That really becoming a man, becoming a responsible adult, doesn't really happen these days at 12 or 13 as maybe it did 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. And so that's why it's usually done at 15, which is 10th grade. Sometimes it's done at high school graduation. And part of the idea was also noticing, even 150 years ago, that there was a drop-off rate in synagogues after a bar or bat mitzvah, well, at that time after a bar mitzvah, that families withdrew from the temple, withdrew from being active in the congregation, and the kids lost out on those years of potential Jewish education. So that was moved to extend that activity and to extend that learning by a few years, a few key years, when our young people are beginning to develop their identity. Confirmation was done not on an individual basis, but was done as a public holiday. Became associated with Shavuot. When is Shavuot? You should all know if you've been following along, and if you remember our class on all of the holidays, Shavuot is in the late spring, early summer. We'll say late spring. 50 days, or 49 days, I should say, after Passover begins. Shavuot became, which is a holiday celebrating receiving the Torah, that became the perfect time to celebrate our young people receiving the beginnings of their learning, the completing the foundation of their basic Judaism so that they could continue on as Jewish adults. It was, as I mentioned, and still is, a collective service where the entire confirmation class, now including both boys and girls, of course, is studying and learning together, and then together lead a service based on their experiences and their learning. I should mention that when confirmation first started, it was already happening in churches. This was a tradition that we borrowed from the Christians. Usually it goes the other way. I always joke, and when somebody who's Christian says, "Oh, I didn't know Jews did that," and I say, "We invented it. You're welcome." This is one we got to give credit where credit is due. Christians had this custom for a while of extending study, although the context was a little bit different in Christianity and still is. The rabbis and the congregations realized 150 years ago that, hey, all of the churches are keeping their kids engaged and involved for 2 or 3 more years than we are. Maybe we can learn something from that. This was a time when a lot of synagogues were interested in modernizing and borrowed different things from other faiths. You'll see piano or organs in a lot of synagogues. You see stained glass in a lot of synagogues. You see a lot of customs. You see modern architecture in a lot of synagogues. You see some of those in our synagogue. There is a historic back and forth that exists between Jews and Christians when we have been living together peacefully. Let's talk about lifelong learning. After confirmation, learning does not end. There are always opportunities. We have, and every synagogue has, adult classes. Adult B'nai Mitzvah, which is especially popular among, this is a great group to talk about adult B'nai Mitzvah, because it's a very popular custom among converts and among women who didn't have the opportunity to become a bat mitzvah. Even though the first bat mitzvah was in the early 20th century, throughout the 20th century, it was not a guaranteed rite of passage for a lot of women. And those of you who lived through most of the 20th century will remember that in the 60s, in the 70s, even in the 80s, it was not a given that a daughter would have a bat mitzvah just like a son had a bar mitzvah. And so many women today haven't had the opportunity to become a bat mitzvah. And of course, anybody who converts to Judaism, becoming an adult B'nai Mitzvah is a completely separate process, and it involves a completely different set of learning. It's more in-depth and more focused on a particular set of activities to lead services. But anyone who's interested, come and talk to me after this course finishes, and we can get an adult B'nai Mitzvah course going here at Temple Emmanuel next year or in a future year. Another great way is after you have mastered, remember, what's the best way to learn? Best way to make sure you've learned something? By teaching. And so that's why we encourage all parents, all grandparents, all adult members of the community to become religious school teachers. By teaching in a religious school, you're relearning so much of your Judaism. I've had many conversations with many religious school teachers, and 201, they've all said, it's been such an incredible opportunity. I feel like I'm learning even more than my students. That's it for this week. We'll say Shavua Tov. If you're on Zoom, stick around because we're going to have a Q&A coming up right now. And hey, we even finished 5 minutes early. When was the last time we did that? Stick around. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. For those of you who are watching this after the fact, come look us up. Join us for live classes anytime during the week. You can email me. You can contact the congregation. All of our information's online. Very easy to get a hold of, and we would love to have you at live classes like this one. Shavua Tov.